"I came to be your wife," said the virgin the mountain man saved 20 years ago. A mountain man hears a knock on his cabin door after 20 long years of silence. Snow howls outside. When he opens it, there she stands. A young woman in a mission shawl, trembling, saying the words that stop his breath cold. "I came to be your wife." He stares, because 20 years ago, he pulled this girl from a burning mission, half dead and forgotten by the world. Now she's returned, carrying a priest's letter and a promise made in his name. But who sent her? And why now? The mountains hide more than snow. A railroad is coming for his land. Her name is on the deed. And in a land where bloodlines decide worth, one act of mercy may cost them everything, as firelight flickers over two souls bound by fate and faith. Can a vow made in ashes become the redemption of a man who lost his soul to war? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon wind whistled through the pines, carrying the first heavy flakes of snow. Jed Turlow's axe bit deep into another log, the sharp crack echoing across the mountainside. His shoulders ached from the day's work, but his weathered hands kept their steady rhythm. The woodpile had to last through whatever storm was brewing over the San Juan peaks. His wolf dog, Shadow, lay nearby in the trampled snow, head resting on massive paws. The animal's ears suddenly pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Jed paused mid-swing, listening. Through the growing curtain of snow, he heard it too, the creak of wagon wheels laboring up the narrow mountain trail. "Easy now," he murmured to Shadow, setting down his axe and reaching for the Winchester propped against a nearby pine. Visitors were rare this high in the mountains, and rarer still with a storm coming on. His fingers found familiar grooves in the rifle's stock as he watched the bend in the trail. The wagon appeared through the swirling snow like a ghost. An old dray horse pulled it, head low against the wind. Jed's finger settled near the trigger, but something about the lone figure on the seat made him hesitate. It was too small for a threat, wrapped tight in what looked like a mission shawl. Shadow's growl softened to a questioning whine as the wagon drew closer. Jed could see now it was a young woman, her dark hair barely visible beneath the heavy wool shawl. She pulled the horse to a stop 20 paces from where he stood, her hands clearly visible on the reins. "Are you Mr. Turlow?" Her voice carried clearly despite the wind, touched with an accent he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Jedediah Turlow?" Jed lowered his rifle slowly, studying her face. She couldn't be more than 20, with features that spoke of both Mexican and Indian blood. Her eyes held steady on his, though he could see exhaustion in the way she gripped the wagon seat. "I'm Turlow," he answered gruffly. "Who's asking?" "Maria Esperanza." She reached carefully into her shawl, drawing out an envelope. "I have come from Santa Fe by train first, then this wagon. I have a letter." Her words faltered as she tried to stand. Jed moved forward as she swayed, her face going pale beneath its natural olive tone. The sealed envelope fluttered from her fingers as her eyes rolled back. "I came to be your wife," she whispered, and then she was falling. He caught her before she hit the wagon's wooden seat, her slight form nearly frozen from the brutal mountain cold. Shadow whined again, pressing close as Jed lifted her into his arms. The horse stamped nervously as snow began to fall in earnest. "Quiet yourself," Jed told the animal, though his own heart was hammering strangely in his chest. He snatched up the fallen letter and tucked it into his coat. "Shadow, mind that horse." The wolf dog positioned himself near the dray's head as Jed carried Maria toward his cabin. The wind was picking up, driving the snow sideways now. He shouldered open the heavy door, ducking into the warmth of his simple home. The fire had burned low in the stone hearth. He laid Maria gently on his bed, little more than a rope-strung cot with a buffalo robe, and moved quickly to stoke the flames. His hands shook slightly as he added fresh logs, his mind spinning with the girl's last words. "Your wife." The phrase echoed in his head as he worked, stealing glances at her still form. What madness was this, that would send a young woman alone into the mountains with such a declaration? He thought of the letter in his coat, but forced himself to see to practical matters first. Outside, the storm was building into a full mountain blow. He led the horse into his lean-to shelter, removing harness and tack with practiced motions. Shadow helped herd the nervous animal into the crude barn, and Jed made sure both creatures had hay before fighting his way back to the cabin through thickening snow. Inside, Maria hadn't stirred. Her breathing was steady, but her skin felt cold as ice when he checked her pulse. He added another log to the fire and finally allowed himself to draw out the letter. The envelope bore an official mission seal from Santa Fe, addressed to him in a precise hand. He broke the wax with his thumbnail, unfolding thick paper in the flickering firelight. The words swam before his eyes as dusk gathered outside the cabin's single window. "Dear Mr. Turlow," it began, "I write to you regarding a matter of grave importance." He managed only the first few paragraphs before the light grew too dim to read. Something about a deathbed promise, a connection to his past that made his chest tight with memories he'd rather forget. He folded the letter carefully, watching Maria's face in the firelight. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Beautiful and young enough to be his daughter, or even granddaughter. What cruel twist of fate had sent her here? And what secrets did the rest of that letter hold? The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's shutters. Snow sifted through tiny gaps in the logs, adding its own voice to winter's song. They were well and truly trapped now, until the storm passed. Jed settled into his chair by the fire, rifle across his knees more from habit than need. Maria slept on, her breathing soft and regular. The firelight played across her features, highlighting cheekbones that spoke of her Apache heritage. Her mission shawl had fallen back, revealing a simple cross on a leather cord around her neck. The sight of it stirred something in Jed's memory. Another woman, another time, when his hands had been stained with war instead of honest work. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the practical problem before him. The storm might last days. He had food enough, and would, but the situation was far from proper. A young woman alone in his cabin, claiming to be his wife. The mountains had their own rules about such things, but even here, reputation mattered. Shadow returned from a final check of the lean-to, shaking snow from his thick coat. The wolf dog settled at Jed's feet with a heavy sigh, yellow eyes fixed on their sleeping guest. Outside, the storm gathered strength, shrieking across the peaks like a lost soul. Jed found himself watching Maria's face in the dancing firelight, trying to make sense of this sudden upheaval in his carefully ordered life. 20 years he'd lived alone in these mountains, hunting and trapping, trading just enough to get by. 20 years of quiet, of running from memories and guilt. Now this girl appears, bearing a letter that threatened to unravel everything. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Maria stirred slightly but didn't wake. Jed pulled his old wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, settling in for a long night's vigil. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. For now, the storm held them all in its grip. Man, woman, dog, and whatever ghosts that letter might contain. Morning crept into the cabin like a cautious visitor. Pale light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting weak shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Jed stirred from his chair, muscles stiff from the night's vigil. During the dark hours, Maria had moved closer to the hearth, wrapped in his spare blanket. She slept peacefully now, her face softened by the morning glow. Shadow nosed the cabin door, eager for his morning routine. Jed eased the heavy latch open, letting in a blast of cold air and his wolf dog's quiet exit. The snow had drifted halfway up the doorframe overnight. He would need to dig out the path to the lean-to soon. But first, the letter. Jed settled back in his chair, drawing the wrinkled pages from his coat pocket. The mission seal caught the early light as he smoothed the paper across his knee. Father Ramon's precise handwriting filled 3 pages, the ink slightly faded, but clear. "Dear Mr. Turlough," he read again, this time taking in every word. "I write to you regarding a matter of grave importance. 20 years ago, you brought a small child to the Santa Fe mission during the border conflicts. She was barely alive, rescued from the burning ruins of San Miguel Mission to the south." Jed's throat tightened. He remembered that night. The smoke, the screams, the little girl clutched to his chest as he rode through darkness. He had been a different man then, an army scout tracking renegades along the Mexican border. The mission raid had sickened him, turned him away from that life forever. "The child, Maria, was placed under my care," the letter continued. "Before you departed, you made a solemn promise. If she lived to adulthood, and if you still drew breath, you would return to make her your wife. This promise was witnessed and recorded by myself and 2 brothers of the order." "Damn fool promise," Jed muttered, but kept reading. "I have raised Maria as my own daughter in Christ, educating her in both letters and practical arts. She speaks 3 languages, knows healing herbs, and carries herself with grace beyond her years. More importantly, she has grown into a woman of deep faith and gentle spirit." The next paragraphs detailed legal matters. A small tract of land, prime bottomland near Santa Fe, had been held in trust all these years. The deed would transfer only to Mrs. Jedediah Turlough upon proof of marriage. The documents were properly notarized, bearing the territorial seal. "I release Maria to fulfill this promise with my blessing," Father Ramon concluded. "She comes to you of her own free will, believing this to be God's plan for her life. I pray you will honor your word and provide her the home she deserves." Jed lowered the pages slowly, looking towards the sleeping woman. 20 years. Had it really been so long? He remembered a tiny, soot-stained face, eyes huge with terror. Now here she was, grown into beauty and grace, come to claim a drunken soldier's rash promise. A soft stirring drew his attention. Maria's eyes opened, dark and clear in the morning light. She sat up carefully, drawing the blanket around her shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Turlough," she said. Her voice was gentle, the accent he'd noticed yesterday softened by years of education. "I hope I have not greatly inconvenienced you." "You remember me?" Jed asked gruffly, holding up the letter. "Not from that night." Maria folded the blanket with precise movements. "But Father Ramon told me the story many times, how you found me when the raiders came, how you carried me to safety and made your promise before God. I was a different man then, younger, foolish with drink and battle fever." Jed stood, moving to stoke the fire. "That promise means nothing now. The law says otherwise." There was no challenge in her tone, only quiet certainty. "And I believe God's hand guided events, then and now." Jed turned to face her, studying her calm expression. "You're educated, young. Surely you don't want to tie yourself to an old mountain man." "What I want is to fulfill my duty," Maria replied, "to honor the promise that saved my life and to make a home where God leads me." She gestured to her travel bag. "I brought food to share, if you'll permit me to prepare breakfast." Something in her dignified manner made refusal impossible. Jed nodded curtly and watched as she unpacked cornmeal, dried fruit, and a small pot of honey. Her movements were graceful and efficient as she worked at his crude hearth. The aroma of cooking soon filled the cabin. Shadow scratched at the door, and Jed let him in, noting how the wolf dog immediately went to sit near Maria. Traitor, he thought, but couldn't blame the animal. There was something soothing about her presence, even as it disrupted his solitary life. "You'll have to leave when the weather clears," Jed said as she served the cornmeal porridge in tin cups. "I'm not the marrying kind anymore, too set in my ways." Maria added a spoonful of honey to his portion before serving herself. "I understand, but I must tell you, Mr. Turlo, that I have nowhere else to go. Father Ramon has retired to Mexico. The mission that was my home has new leadership now." Jed frowned into his cup. The porridge was better than anything he'd eaten in months, the honey a rare treat. "There are other missions, other towns, where a woman of mixed blood, traveling alone, would find welcome?" Maria's question held no bitterness, only simple truth. "I have prayed about this journey for many months. I am where I am meant to be." Before Jed could argue further, Shadow's ears pricked up. A gust of wind rattled the cabin, and fresh snow sifted through the window seams. Jed rose to peer outside. The storm had strengthened again. Drifts piled against the cabin walls, and the path he'd cleared to the lean-to was already filling in. The peaks were lost in swirling white, and the wind carried that deep mountain tone that meant business. "No traveling today," he muttered. "Nor likely tomorrow neither." "Then we have time to know each other better," Maria said simply. She began cleaning up their breakfast things with practiced ease. "Would you show me where to find more firewood? We should prepare for a long storm." Jed sighed heavily, watching her move about his cabin as if she belonged there. The situation was impossible, yet he couldn't turn her out into the snow. And truth be told, something about her quiet presence stirred memories of better days, of a time when he'd believed in promises and redemption. "I'll fetch the wood," he said gruffly, reaching for his coat. "You tend the fire." Shadow followed him out into the storm, where Jed began loading his arms with split logs from the covered pile. The wind bit through his clothes, carrying the scent of more snow to come. They were well and truly trapped up here. Him and this woman from his past, with nothing but time and memories between them. Inside the cabin, Maria had swept the floor and was setting out herbs from her bag to dry near the fire. The domestic touches made his throat tight with longing he thought he'd buried years ago. He stacked the wood carefully by the hearth, avoiding her eyes. "Much obliged for breakfast," he managed, "and the cleaning." "It is the least I can do," Maria replied softly. "To repay your kindness, both now and then." Jed had no answer for that. He busied himself checking his rifle, while Shadow settled contentedly at Maria's feet. Outside, the storm wrapped around them like a blanket, forcing this unlikely pair to face the consequences of a promise made 2 decades ago. The mountain storm settled in like an unwelcome guest, trapping Jed and Maria in an uneasy fellowship. Morning light filtered weakly through ice-crusted windows as Jed checked his trap lines near the cabin. The familiar routine helped quiet his troubled mind, though he couldn't escape awareness of the smoke rising steadily from his chimney, evidence of another's presence in his solitary world. Inside, Maria had transformed his bachelor's chaos into something resembling order. She'd found his neglected broom and swept years of dust from corners. His few dishes gleamed from proper washing, and his threadbare quilts hung by the fire, freshly beaten and warming. The changes made him irritable, yet he couldn't deny the comfort they brought. "Ain't necessary to fuss so much," he grumbled on the second morning, watching her sort through his collection of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Some of these have lost their potency," Maria replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "I can replace them come spring if you wish. The mountains here must have good medicine plants." Jed grunted non-committally and returned to mending a broken trap spring. The peaceful sounds of her movement through his cabin settled into a rhythm, the soft swish of her skirts, the quiet clatter of his few cooking implements, the murmur of Spanish prayers as she worked. By the third day, the storm's fury had gentled to steady snowfall. Jed sat at his workbench, replacing the handle of an old axe. Maria's clear voice lifted in a Spanish hymn he half remembered from his army days. The melody stirred something in his chest, memories of candle-lit missions and hope he'd long ago abandoned. "That song," he said gruffly, not looking up from his work. "Heard it before, down in old Mexico." Maria's singing paused. "It speaks of God's mercy, how it follows us all our days." She hesitated, then added softly, "Like it followed me, through you." Jed's hand stilled at the axe handle. "Don't go making more of that night than it was. Any soldier would have done the same." "But it was you God sent," Maria said simply. She returned to her tasks, humming the hymn's refrain. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Jed pretended to doze in his chair by the fire. Maria knelt in her usual spot near the hearth, hands clasped, in prayer. Her whispered words carried clearly in the cabin's silence. "Lord, bless this man who saved my life," she murmured in English, perhaps intending him to hear. "Guide his path back to your light. Help me show him the same mercy he once showed a frightened child." Jed shifted uncomfortably, something raw and painful squeezing his heart. He'd spent 20 years pushing away thoughts of God's mercy, believing his hands too blood-stained for redemption. This woman's quiet faith stripped away his careful defenses. The fourth morning dawned bright and cold, the storm finally spent. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow that blanketed the mountain. Jed rose early, determination set in his weathered face. He went to the lean-to and began harnessing his mule. "What are you doing?" Maria appeared in the cabin doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "Getting ready to take you down to town," Jed replied, checking the mule's traces. "Storm's passed. No reason for you to stay stuck up here anymore." "I cannot leave." Maria's voice held that same quiet certainty he'd come to recognize. "My name is bound to your land deed. Father Ramon was very clear about the terms." Jed turned to face her, frustration evident in his stance. "Let me see that paper again." Maria brought out the document, now carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Jed read it through once more, paying special attention to the legal language. The trust transfer was ironclad. The land would pass only to Mrs. Jedediah Turlow upon proof of marriage. "There must be some way around this," he muttered. "There is not." Maria stood straight and dignified despite her simple clothes. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Turlow, and I believe I am where God means me to be." Jed ran a hand over his beard, mind working. The situation seemed impossible, yet he couldn't bring himself to force her down the mountain. These past days had shown him she was capable and hard-working, no burden to his household. What if, he paused, considering his words carefully. What if you stayed on as my hired help? Just until spring, mind you. Give us both time to figure out a proper solution. Hope brightened Maria's face. "You would allow this?" "Ain't right to turn you out with winter coming on," Jed said gruffly. "You can earn your keep cooking and such. Come spring, We'll sort out this deed business proper." "Thank you." Maria's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I will start by making a proper supper. There is venison in your storehouse that would make excellent stew." Jed watched her hurry back to the cabin, his emotions a tangle he couldn't sort out. Shadow padded up beside him, tail wagging hopefully. "Don't you start," Jed told the wolf dog. "This is temporary, you hear?" But as evening settled over the mountain, bringing with it the rich aroma of venison stew and the soft sounds of Maria moving about his kitchen, Jed felt something shift inside him. The cabin seemed warmer somehow, more like the home it had once been before grief and guilt drove him to isolation. They ate their supper in comfortable silence, sharing the hearth that had known only solitude for so many years. Maria's stew was rich with herbs she'd found in his stores, the meat tender and flavorful. When she offered him seconds, Jed accepted with a gruff, "Much obliged," that earned him another sunshine smile. Later, as Maria washed their dishes and hummed another of her gentle hymns, Jed sat watching the fire. Shadow drowsed between them, equally content in both their company. The evening's peace felt like a gift, unearned but freely given, like the mercy Maria spoke of in her prayers. "There's extra blankets in the chest," he said as Maria finished her tasks. "Weather's still cold. Best keep them close." "Thank you." Maria gathered the blankets, preparing her pallet near the hearth. "Good night, Mr. Turlow." "Night," he replied, not yet ready to use her given name, but feeling the walls of his solitude crumbling stone by stone. Outside, stars wheeled above the snow-covered peaks, witness to this unlikely truce between past and present, between guilt and grace. Inside the cabin, two souls from different worlds found common ground in simple courtesy and shared warmth, while winter settled deep around them. January days settled into a quiet rhythm in the mountain cabin. Morning light would find Maria already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee in the battered tin pot. Jed would grunt his thanks, take his cup outside to check his trap lines, while Maria turned her attention to the endless tasks of keeping house. Today she sat by the window, making use of the pale winter sunlight. Her nimble fingers worked at mending the faded curtains she'd found stuffed in the cabin's storage chest. The fabric was old but serviceable, and the neat stitches slowly closed years of neglect. Jed watched her from his workbench, where he was oiling his rifle. Her presence had brought changes he hadn't expected, not just in the tidier cabin or better meals, but in the very air of the place. The silence that had been his constant companion for so many years now held different qualities. As dusk approached, Maria lit the lamp and settled in her usual spot near the hearth. From her bundle of belongings, she drew out a small leather-bound Bible, its pages soft with use. Her voice, clear and measured, filled the cabin with familiar verses. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Jed's hands slowed on the rifle. The words stirred memories he'd rather forget. Blood on snow, screaming horses, the acrid stench of gunpowder. 20 years of violence as a trapper and scout had left marks deeper than the bullet scar in his leg. Sleep brought dreams that had him reaching for his knife, reliving moments when survival meant dealing death. But worst were the dreams of the mission fire. They came more frequently now, with Maria's presence. In them, he was again pushing through smoke-filled corridors, hearing children cry, the heat of flames, the crackle of burning timbers, the weight of a small body in his arms. "Mr. Turlow?" Maria's voice drew him back. She had stopped reading, watching him with concern. "Are you unwell?" Just thinking, he muttered, returning to his task. But his hands trembled slightly on the rifle stock. Maria closed her Bible carefully. I have been thinking too, she said softly, about that night, the fire. She touched the cross at her throat, a gesture he'd noticed she made when gathering courage. I remember very little, but some things stayed with me. The smell of smoke, of course, but also pine, like the forest after rain. The man who carried me smelled of pine. Jed set the rifle down, unable to meet her eyes. Probably had pine sap all over my coat, he said gruffly. Was working as a scout then, living rough in the woods. Maria's breath caught. So, it was you. Father Ramon told me, but... She rose, taking a step toward him. I never properly thanked you. No need, Jed said quickly, uncomfortable with the shine of tears in her eyes. Did what anyone would have done. Not anyone would have run into a burning building, she insisted. Not anyone would have ensured I was safe, found me a new home. Her voice wavered. You gave me a future that night. Before Jed could respond, a long howl split the evening quiet. Shadow's ears pricked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. More howls answered. Wolves, and close to the corral where the mule was kept. Stay inside, Jed ordered, grabbing his rifle. He shrugged into his coat and stepped out into the bitter night air. The moon cast enough light to see by, silvering the snow. Dark shapes moved at the edge of the corral. 3, maybe 4 wolves. The mule was snorting in fear, stamping the frozen ground. Jed raised his rifle and fired 2 shots into the air. The sharp cracks echoed off the mountainside, and the wolves melted away into the shadows. He waited, watching, until Shadow's relaxed posture told him the danger had passed. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, he found Maria had placed one of the newly beaten quilts on his chair by the fire. The gesture, simple as it was, caught him off guard. How long had it been since anyone had thought of his comfort? Thank you, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He settled into the chair, letting the fire's warmth seep into his bones. Maria resumed her place, opening the Bible once more. The lamplight caught the silver threading in her dark hair, and Jed found himself watching the way her lips moved silently over familiar words. The book she held was well worn, its leather cover soft with age. That Bible, he said suddenly, looks old. Maria smiled, running her fingers over the cover. It belonged to my mother, one of the few things that survived. She trailed off, then added quietly, Father Ramon saved it, from the mission. He gave it to me when I was old enough to read. Jed nodded, understanding what she left unsaid. They shared that night of fire and smoke, their lives connected by tragedy and mercy. Perhaps that was why her presence didn't chafe as he'd expected. She knew something of loss, of the way life could change in an instant. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Shadow, sprawled between them, thumped his tail contentedly. Maria returned to her reading, her voice soft but steady in the gathering night. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Jed closed his eyes, letting the familiar words wash over him. The guilt and memories still weighed heavy, but something else was there too. A sense of purpose he'd thought long lost. Outside, the wind sang through pine branches and the wolves called from distant ridges. But here, in this moment, there was warmth and peace and the first tentative stirrings of hope. Maria continued reading, her voice a gentle thread weaving through the quiet. The cabin that had been Jed's fortress of solitude was changing, becoming something else, a place where past and present met, where old wounds might finally begin to heal. 2 weeks passed in the mountain cabin, each day falling into familiar patterns. The January cold kept its grip on the peaks, but inside, warmth and routine had settled between the unlikely pair. Then came the morning that changed everything. The sound of crunching snow drew Shadow's attention first. The wolfdog's ears pricked up, and he moved to the window, tail wagging, a friendly visitor then. Jed reached for his rifle anyway, old habits dying hard, but relaxed when he recognized the figure trudging up the path. "Mail carrier," he told Maria, who had paused in her bread-making. The young man, barely visible beneath layers of wool and fur, made his way carefully towards the cabin on snowshoes, a leather satchel slung across his chest. "Morning, Mr. Turlow." The carrier, Tommy Wilson, stamped snow from his feet at the threshold. His face was red from exertion and cold. "Got quite a bundle for you today." Maria wiped her hands on her apron and brought him a cup of coffee while Jed sorted through the delivery. Several letters, a newspaper, and what looked like official documents. "Much obliged, ma'am," Tommy said, gulping the hot drink gratefully. His eyes darted between Maria and Jed, curiosity plain on his young face, but he knew better than to ask questions. "Better get moving before the afternoon snow starts. They're saying another storm's coming." After the carrier left, Jed spread the items on the table. Most were standard correspondence, supply catalogs, a letter from his fur buyer in Denver. The newspaper was 2 weeks old, but news was news in the mountains. One envelope, however, caught his eye. It bore the seal of Durango's land office. "Would you read it?" he asked Maria, pushing the official-looking document toward her. His pride had finally yielded to practicality. Her education meant she could decipher the legal language better than he could. Maria smoothed the paper carefully. "Notice of intent to file water rights claims," she began, her clear voice filling the cabin. As she continued reading, her brow furrowed. "The Denver and Rio Grande Railway Company hereby gives notice of intention to file claims on all available water sources within the designated survey area, including but not limited to natural springs, streams, and—" She trailed off, scanning ahead. Jed's hands clenched on the table edge. "What else?" "They've included a map," she said, unfolding a thin sheet. "Jed, the spring that feeds your creek, it's marked here. They're claiming rights to it." Jed stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The spring was the lifeblood of his homestead, feeding the creek that watered his garden and the corrals. Without it, the land would be worthless. "They can't just take it," he growled. "That spring's on my property." Maria read further, her finger tracing the lines of small print. "There's something here about prior claims." Her eyes widened. "Jed, the deed, the one Father Ramon sent, with my name on it. It specifically mentions water rights." Jed stared at her, realization dawning. The priest's arrangement, which had seemed so presumptuous, now looked like providence. A married woman's property rights were stronger than a single man's claim, especially with the railroad companies pushing west. "Let me see that trust document again," he said. Maria retrieved it from her trunk, where she kept her few precious possessions. The legal paper clearly stated that the land, including all waters and improvements thereon, was to be held in trust for Mrs. Jed Turlow. "I'll sign whatever you need," Maria said quietly. "The water rights should be in your name alone." Jed shook his head, pacing the cabin's length. "No," he said finally. "Not yet. Something ain't right about this. I need to ride into Durango, talk to the land office myself. But the snow. Storm won't hit till tomorrow afternoon. If I leave at first light, I can make it to town and back before the worst hits." He began gathering his gear, checking his saddlebags. "You'll be all right here?" Maria straightened her shoulders. "I know how to handle myself," she said simply. Jed nodded, remembering how capable she'd proven these past weeks. Still, he spent the evening showing her where he kept extra ammunition, making sure she knew how to work the heavy door bar. "Shadow'll stay with you," he said, checking the loads in his old army revolver. "He's better than any watchman." He held the pistol out to her. "You know how to use one of these?" "Father Ramon taught all the older girls," she said, accepting the weapon with familiar hands. "He said women alone should know how to protect themselves." "Smart man," Jed muttered. He watched as she checked the cylinder with practiced movements. Another surprise from this quiet woman who kept defying his expectations. That night, neither slept much. Maria spent hours in prayer, her whispered Spanish mixing with the wind's howl. Jed lay on his bedroll, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, the pop of the fire, Shadow's steady breathing, the creak of timbers in the cold. Strange how quickly he'd grown used to sharing this space. Long before dawn, Jed rose and dressed quietly. Maria was already up, pressing a package of journey bread and dried meat into his hands. The cabin was warm from the fresh-built fire, and for a moment he hesitated. The thought of leaving her alone gnawed at him. "God go with you," Maria said softly, pressing something into his coat pocket. Later, he would find it was her mother's rosary. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed gruffly, covering his concern with practical words. "Shadow knows his business. If he growls, pay attention. The pistol is loaded and ready," she finished. "I will be fine, Jed Turlow. Go safely and return the same." He nodded once and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The sky was heavy with threatening clouds, but visibility was still good. His mule, though unhappy about the early start, stood quietly for saddling. From the doorway, Maria's lantern cast a pool of light into the snow. Shadow sat at her feet, alert and watchful. The last thing Jed saw as he turned down the trail was her hand raised in blessing, silhouetted against the warm light of home. The word surprised him. Home. Somewhere in these weeks, the cabin had become more than just shelter. He touched the rosary in his pocket, its wooden beads smooth with years of prayers, and urged his mule toward Durango and whatever answers waited there. Behind him, Maria watched until he disappeared into the darkness. Then she barred the door, just as he'd instructed, and turned to face her vigil. Shadow pressed against her leg, offering silent comfort as the first scattered snowflakes began to fall. The late winter thaw turned the mountain trails treacherous. Jed's mule picked her way carefully through partially melted drifts, the animal's sure-footedness proving its worth with each careful step. The journey that normally took one day stretched into two, as Jed was forced to lead the mule through particularly dangerous patches, his boots sinking deep into the wet snow. He spent one cold night huddled under a granite overhang, wrapped in his blanket and thinking about Maria alone in the cabin. Shadow would protect her, he knew, but worry gnawed at him nonetheless. The rosary beads in his pocket clicked softly as he shifted, reminding him of her quiet faith. By midday of the second day, Durango's smoke-stained buildings came into view. The town had grown since his last visit 6 months ago. The railroad's influence showed in the new wooden sidewalks and the telegraph office's fresh paint. Jed tied his mule outside the land office, a 2-story brick building that looked out of place among the frontier structures. Inside, a clerk directed him to the second floor. The nameplate on the door read, "Thomas Cargill, Land Agent, Denver and Rio Grande Railway." Jed knocked, his wet boots leaving puddles on the polished floor. "Enter," called a precise voice. Thomas Cargill sat behind a massive oak desk, everything about him speaking of Eastern refinement. His suit was perfectly pressed despite the afternoon heat from the pot-bellied stove, and his hands were soft and ink-stained. He glanced up at Jed with the practiced patience of a man used to dealing with rough frontier types. "How may I assist you?" Cargill asked, setting aside his pen. "Name's Jed Turlow. Got your notice about claiming water rights on my land." Jed placed the document on the desk, trying to keep his voice level. "That spring's been part of my homestead for 15 years. Cargill picked up the paper, examined it briefly. "Ah, yes, the survey area north of town. You have proof of your claim?" Jed produced the deed, along with Father Ramon's notarized trust document. "Everything's legal and proper." The land agent studied the papers, his eyebrows rising slightly. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile that made Jed's hands itch to form fists. "I see the problem," Cargill said smoothly. "This trust document places the water rights under the name of—" He paused, checking the paper again. "Maria Esperanza Turlo. A Mexican Indian female, I presume?" "My wife," Jed said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "What of it?" Cargill's smile widened fractionally. "Company policy, Mr. Turlow, is quite clear regarding land claims involving—" He paused delicately. "Persons of mixed heritage. Such claims are considered void under current railroad regulations." The blood rushed to Jed's face. His fist came down hard on the oak desk, sending papers flying. Cargill didn't flinch, but his hand moved toward the drawer where most men kept a gun. "That's thievery wrapped in fancy words," Jed growled, leaning forward. "The land is legal, the water rights are legal, and you know it." "The company's position is quite firm," Cargill replied. "We begin damming operations within 3 weeks. If you wish to dispute the matter, you may file an appeal with the territorial court in Denver. Though I should mention such appeals typically take months to resolve." Jed's whole body trembled with the effort of holding back violence. The urge to reach across the desk and throttle this smug-faced man was almost overwhelming. But that would only make things worse. For him and for Maria. "This isn't finished," he said through clenched teeth. "Good day, Mr. Turlow," Cargill replied pleasantly, already returning to his paperwork. Jed stormed out of the office, his boots thundering down the stairs. Outside, he stood in the weak winter sunlight, trying to calm his racing heart. The injustice of it burned in his gut like poison. They meant to steal the land simply because Maria's heritage gave them an excuse to do so. The ride home seemed longer, his thoughts darker than the gathering clouds. As dusk approached on the first day back, he spotted the cross marking the Mission Way station. He'd passed it countless times without a second glance, but today something made him rein in his mule. The small chapel was empty save for a few guttering candles. Jed removed his hat, feeling awkward and out of place. How long had it been since he'd set foot in a house of God? 20 years? More? He sank onto a rough wooden bench, the rosary beads heavy in his pocket. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the pop and hiss of the candles. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rusty with disuse. "I ain't been much for praying. Made my share of mistakes. Done things I ain't proud of." He paused, struggling with the words. "But that girl up there, she believes in you. Believes in goodness, even after everything she's seen. I'm asking, help me protect what's rightfully hers." The prayer felt clumsy, inadequate. But as he sat there in the flickering light, a certain peace settled over him. The way forward became clearer. Not easier, but clearer. He would fight for Maria's rights, not with fists or guns, but with the same quiet strength she showed every day. The final day's ride brought him home as darkness was falling. Fresh smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and lamplight glowed behind the curtains Maria had mended. Shadow's bark greeted him before he'd even dismounted. The door opened, spilling warm light into the gathering dusk. Maria stood in the doorway, relief clear on her face. She still held his old coat, a needle trailing thread where she'd been mending a tear. "Welcome home," she said softly. Jed led his mule to the barn, took care of the tired animal, and gathered his saddlebags. His bones ached with exhaustion, but his heart felt lighter than it had in days. When he entered the cabin, Maria had hot coffee waiting and stew warming on the stove. She didn't ask about his journey immediately, giving him time to thaw out and find his words. Only after he'd eaten and settled in his chair by the fire did she speak. "The railroad men," she said, her needle moving steadily through the worn fabric of his coat. "They will try to take the water?" "Yes." He watched her hands work, steady and sure. "But we ain't giving up without a fight. That spring belongs to you, legal and proper, no matter what they say." She looked up at him, reading something in his face that made her eyes soften. "You prayed," she said simply. Jed touched the rosary in his pocket. "Reckon I did. Been a long time." Maria nodded and returned to her mending. The lamplight caught the silver threads she'd worked into the torn sleeve, making them gleam like stars against the dark wool. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin was warm and bright, and for the first time in years, Jed felt truly at peace with his purpose. Maria ladled the venison stew into 2 earthenware bowls, the steam rising with the scent of sage and wild onions she'd dried last autumn. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them like a blanket against the whistling wind outside. Jed sat heavily at the rough-hewn table, his shoulders still tense from the long ride. "The stew smells mighty fine," he said, accepting the bowl with weathered hands. "Been thinking about it these past few days on the trail?" Maria settled across from him, smoothing her skirt. A single candle flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. "Will you tell me what happened in Durango?" she asked softly. Jed stirred his stew, gathering his thoughts. The bitter taste of that meeting with Cargill still burned in his throat. "Met with the railroad's land agent, fellow named Cargill, all dressed up fancy like he just stepped off a Boston stage." He described the meeting, his voice growing harder as he recalled Cargill's smug dismissal. "He said the claim was void on account of—" He paused, looking at her apologetically. "On account of you being part Apache and Mexican." Maria's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, but her face remained calm. "I see," she said quietly. "It ain't right," Jed burst out, his fist clenching on the table. "That spring's been part of this land since before any of us came here. They can't just take it because some fancy paper says so." "The spring," Maria said, setting down her spoon. "Father Ramon told me something about it before I left Santa Fe." She folded her hands in her lap, her dark eyes distant with memory. "My mother's people, the Apache, they considered it a sacred place, a place of cleansing and healing." Jed's spoon clattered against his bowl. The words hit him like a physical blow, stirring memories he'd tried for years to bury. His throat went dry. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice rough. "Something I ain't proud of." Maria watched him steadily, waiting. 20 years back, before I found you at the mission, I was a different man. Worked as an army scout, tracking raiders." He stared down at his scarred hands. "There was a fight, right near that spring. I was with a cavalry unit, hunting a band they said had stolen horses." The candlelight flickered across Maria's face as she listened. "It was dawn when we found them, women and children at the spring, performing some kind of ceremony." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. We didn't ask questions, just opened fire. I never knew if any of them were your kin." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop of the fire and the distant howl of wind. Jed couldn't bring himself to look at her, shame burning in his chest like hot lead. To his surprise, Maria reached across the table and took his scarred hand in both of hers. Her touch was gentle, accepting. "Forgiveness belongs to God, not men," she said softly in Spanish, then repeated it in English. "The past cannot be changed, but the future is still to be written." Something broke inside Jed's chest, a wall he'd built around his heart years ago. His rough fingers tightened around hers as tears he hadn't shed in decades burned his eyes. "I aim to make it right," he said hoarsely. "Don't know how yet, but I swear on my soul I'll find a way." Maria squeezed his hand once more before releasing it. God doesn't ask us to understand his path, only to walk it with faith. They finished their meal in companionable silence. After the dishes were cleared, Maria knelt by the hearth for her evening prayers, her lips moving silently as she worked her rosary beads. The firelight caught the silver cross at her throat, the same one she'd worn as a child when he'd carried her from the burning mission. Jed watched her for a long moment, then walked to where his rifle hung above the mantel. It was an old Spencer carbine, his constant companion through years of violence and loneliness. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted it from its pegs. Maria looked up at the movement, her prayers pausing. Without a word, Jed placed the rifle on the mantel instead of hanging it. The gesture felt both foreign and right, a laying down of arms, a choice to trust in something beyond bullets and gunpowder. Maria's eyes met his, understanding passing between them without words. She returned to her prayers, but now her voice carried softly through the cabin. "Padre nuestro, que estás en los cielos." Jed settled into his chair, letting the familiar words of the Lord's Prayer wash over him in Spanish and English. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, something new had taken root, something that felt like hope. The last patches of snow melted from the south-facing slopes, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Inside the cabin, Maria folded winter blankets and packed essential supplies while Jed inspected the mule cart's wheels. The mountain air carried the fresh scent of spring, but with it came urgency. The railroad surveyors would arrive with the warmer weather. "Best wrap that deed packet good and tight," Jed called from outside. "Weather's changing fast. Could catch rain before Durango." Maria nodded, carefully wrapping the precious documents in oilcloth and securing them with twine. Her fingers traced the edge of Father Ramon's letter before tucking it safely away. The past months had transformed the cabin from a stranger's shelter to something like home. Now they had to defend it. They set out at dawn, the loaded cart creaking behind Jed's sturdy mule. Maria rode her own horse, a gentle mare Jed had traded for during winter. The trail descended through stands of aspen and pine, their path marked by melting snowdrifts and muddy patches. 3 days to Durango, if the weather holds, Jed said, glancing at the clouds gathering over the western peaks. "We'll stop at Thompson's trading post tonight. Old Jake, Thompson's got rooms for travelers." Maria adjusted her shawl against the morning chill. "I have heard of Mr. Thompson. Father Ramon said he trades fair with all people." "That he does," Jed agreed. "Known him 20 years or more. Honest man." They traveled steadily through the day, stopping only to rest the animals and share a simple lunch of cornbread and dried venison. Maria noticed how Jed's eyes constantly scanned the trail ahead and behind, his old scout's habits showing through. Though he carried his rifle, it remained wrapped in canvas, a continued symbol of his changing heart. As dusk approached, smoke from Thompson's chimney appeared around a bend. The trading post was a sturdy log structure with a covered porch and attached stable. Several horses were already tied outside, their riders gathered around a fire pit. The conversations quieted as Jed and Maria rode up. Jake Thompson himself stepped out, his gray beard catching the last sunlight. "Well, if it ain't old Jed Turlow. Been wondering if you'd frozen solid up there this winter." His eyes shifted to Maria, curiosity evident but respectful. "Evening, Jake." Jed dismounted stiffly. "Need a room for the night and stable space for the animals." Course. Got one room left." Thompson's gaze moved between them, but he asked no questions. "Sarah can show the lady where to freshen up while we tend to your stock." Inside, the trading post's main room buzzed with low conversation. A group of miners warmed themselves by the pot-bellied stove, while two ranch hands played cards at a corner table. Maria felt their stares as she followed Sarah Thompson upstairs, but she held her head high, just as the sisters at the mission had taught her. Later, as they shared supper in the common room, the whispers grew more noticeable. Words like peculiar and ain't natural drifted from the other tables. Maria saw Jed's jaw tighten, his hand clenching around his spoon. She touched his arm gently. "The food is very good," she said in a clear, calm voice. "Much like the stew your mother taught me to make." The simple domestic reference, delivered with quiet dignity, seemed to deflate the gossip around them. Several of the onlookers turned back to their own meals, perhaps seeing not a scandal, but simply a man and woman sharing supper. Jed's tension eased slightly. "Sarah's always been a fine cook," he agreed, matching her composed tone. They finished their meal in peace, though Maria noticed how he positioned himself between her and the other patrons as they climbed the stairs to their separate sleeping quarters. The next 2 days brought steady travel through awakening spring landscapes. Patches of wildflowers dotted the meadows, and new leaves sparkled on the aspens. They passed scattered homesteads and mining camps, drawing curious looks but facing no direct confrontation. On the afternoon of the third day, Durango's church spire appeared above the trees. The town had grown since Jed's recent visit, with new buildings rising along the muddy main street. The railroad's influence showed in the telegraph lines and freight wagons laden with steel rails. "Mrs. Callahan's boarding house should be just past the Mercantile," Jed said, guiding the cart through the busy street. "Known her since her husband worked surveys for the railroad before the accident." The boarding house was a neat 2-story structure with white painted trim and flower boxes waiting for spring planting. As they pulled up, a woman in her 40s emerged onto the porch. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back severely, but her face softened with recognition. "Jedediah Turlow," she said, descending the steps. "I thought that might be you coming up the street." Her sharp eyes took in Maria and the loaded cart. "And you must be Miss Esperanza. Father Ramon's letter arrived yesterday." Maria blinked in surprise. "You know Father Ramon?" "We correspond about his mission school students. I taught for many years myself." Mrs. Callahan's smile was genuine. "Come inside, both of you. You look worn from the trail, and I've just put coffee on." The boarding house interior was modest but immaculate, with well-worn furniture and carefully mended curtains. Mrs. Callahan led them to a small parlor where a coffee pot bubbled on the heating stove. "I've kept 2 rooms for you," she said, pouring 3 cups, "and I believe I can help with your situation. My late husband's partner still practices law here in town. He's no friend to the railroad, not since they fought paying widows' benefits after the bridge collapse." Jed and Maria exchanged glances. "We're much obliged, Mrs. Callahan," Jed said carefully, "but we don't want to bring trouble to your door." The widow's chin lifted, Trouble? I've lived through railroad politics and mining wars, Mr. Turlow. I know right from wrong, and what they're trying to do with your spring water claim is wrong. She handed them each a cup of coffee. Besides, this town could use a reminder that not all progress comes from steel rails and stock certificates. Maria sipped her coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her tired body. Outside the window, Durango's evening activity continued. Merchants closing shops, miners heading to saloons, proper ladies hurrying home before dark. Tomorrow they would face whatever challenges came, but tonight they had found safe harbor with an unexpected ally. The coffee cups clinked gently as Mrs. Callahan gathered them. I'll show you to your rooms now. You'll want to rest before facing the land office tomorrow. She paused, studying them both. And don't worry about the gossips. I've lived here long enough to know that God's plans don't always fit into neat little boxes of other people's making. As they followed her up the narrow stairs, Maria felt Jed's presence close behind her, steady and protective. They had traveled far from the isolated cabin, but something stronger than distance bound them now, a shared purpose that went beyond property rights or marriage contracts. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Morning sunlight streamed through Durango's courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Jed adjusted his collar, uncomfortable in his freshly pressed shirt. Maria sat beside him on the wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing her best mission dress and the cross her mother had given her. The courthouse hallway smelled of pine soap and old paper. A clerk's pen scratched nearby, and boots clicked on the wooden floor as people passed. Jed fought the urge to pace, his old leg wound aching from the morning's damp weather. Judge Wilkes will see you now, announced a young clerk, gesturing toward the office door. The judge's chamber was modest but dignified, lined with law books and maps. Judge Amos Wilkes himself sat behind a solid oak desk, his silver hair and weathered face speaking of years spent serving both law and gospel. His eyes, sharp beneath busy brows, studied them as they entered. Mr. Turlow, the judge said, rising. Mrs. Callahan mentioned you'd be coming. He turned to Maria with a gentle nod. And this must be Miss Esperanza. Your Honor, Jed began, then hesitated. He'd rehearsed this speech all morning but found himself struggling for words. Maria spoke softly. We have come about a land trust, Your Honor, and a promise made long ago. Indeed. Judge Wilkes gestured to the chairs before his desk. Mrs. Callahan gave me a brief overview, but I'd like to hear the full story from you both. Jed pulled Father Ramon's letter from his vest pocket, along with the trust deed. As he explained their situation, the judge listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When Jed described the railroad's attempt to invalidate Maria's claim, Wilkes's face darkened. I've seen similar tactics before, the judge said, examining the documents. They try to exploit any perceived weakness in a claim. He looked up at Maria. Though I suspect they underestimate both your strength and your rights under the law, young lady. Maria met his gaze steadily. Father Ramon believed the law should protect all God's children equally, Your Honor. A wise man, your Father Ramon. Judge Wilkes stood, walking to his window. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the town below. There is a way to make this claim ironclad, he said finally, but it would require a certain commitment from both of you. Jed shifted in his chair. What kind of commitment? The judge turned back to face them. If we file this as a joint marital property, with both your names, the railroad's lawyers would find it much harder to challenge. A marriage certificate carries more weight than a trust deed. He held up a hand as Jed started to speak. I understand your situation is unusual, but I'm authorized to perform civil ceremonies, and what's done in my chambers stays in my chambers." Maria's cheeks flushed, pink, but her voice was steady. "You would marry us here? Now?" "A simple civil ceremony to accompany the legal filing," Wilkes explained. "You could speak your vows privately, with only God and the law as witness." He smiled slightly. "I was a union chaplain before I was a judge. I've married folks in stranger circumstances." Jed looked at Maria, really looked at her for the first time that morning. She sat straight-backed in her chair, dignity in every line of her posture. The sunlight caught the silver cross at her throat, and he remembered her quiet prayers by their cabin's fireplace. "It's your choice," he said softly. "I won't hold you to any promise you didn't make yourself." Maria touched the cross at her neck, then nodded. "I believe this is why God led me to your cabin, Jedediah Turlow. I choose to honor both Father Ramon's wish and my own heart." Judge Wilkes moved to stand before his desk. "Very well then. Please rise and join hands." They stood, turning to face each other. Maria's small hand felt warm in Jed's calloused grip. The judge opened his Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of use. "Before God, and by the authority vested in me," Wilkes began, his voice carrying the resonance of his chaplain days, "I ask you both to speak your vows with honest hearts." The ceremony was brief but solemn. Jed's voice cracked slightly as he promised to protect and cherish. Maria's response came clear and true, her English touched with just a hint of Spanish melody. Judge Wilkes prayed over them, asking God's blessing on their union and their land. When it was done, the judge had them sign the marriage record and added his own signature with a flourish. "There," he said, sanding the ink. "Now let's see those railroad lawyers try to challenge this claim." He drafted a new deed, naming them jointly as property holders, attaching it to their marriage certificate. "I've added a note citing specific territorial statutes," he explained, "and my personal seal as witness to the proceedings." Maria studied the documents carefully before signing, her penmanship neat and precise. Jed watched her, wondering at the strange path that had led them here, from a burning mission 20 years ago to this quiet courthouse chamber. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said gruffly as they prepared to leave. "We're much obliged." Judge Wilkes shook their hands warmly. "Sometimes the law and justice manage to walk the same path," he said. "May God grant you both peace in your mountain home." Outside the courthouse, the spring afternoon had turned golden. Neither spoke as they walked down the street, both still processing the morning's events. The smell of cooking food drew them to a small tavern where an Irish widow served heavy bowls of beef stew and fresh bread. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing occasional glances across the table. Through the tavern's window, Jed could see their loaded cart waiting in the street, ready for the journey home. Home. The word felt different now, fuller somehow. "We should start back before sunset," he said finally, pushing away his empty bowl. "Weather's holding fair for traveling." Maria nodded, gathering her shawl. "Yes, I would like to reach the cabin before dark." She smiled slightly. "Our cabin now? Truly before God and law both." They left coins on the table and walked out into the late afternoon sunshine. As Jed helped Maria into the cart, their hands touched briefly, and a moment of peaceful understanding passed between them. The legal papers were safely stored in his vest pocket, but the real strength of their bond lay in something deeper, a shared purpose born of mercy, justice, and perhaps a touch of divine providence. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they started the long ride home, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Their shadows stretched long across the trail ahead, two figures moving together toward the high country and whatever future awaited them there. The journey home took 5 long days. Spring thaws had turned the mountain trails treacherous, forcing them to pick their way carefully between muddy patches and rushing streams. Their cartwheels often sank deep in the softening earth, requiring both of them to push while their mule strained in the harness. Jed kept a watchful eye on Maria during their slow progress, but she never complained. She walked beside the cart when needed, her skirts hitched up above sturdy boots, humming old Spanish hymns that seemed to calm both mule and man alike. At night, they camped beneath the stars, sharing quiet meals of beans and jerky while coyotes called in the distance. On the 5th evening, familiar peaks finally rose before them. The cabin's chimney came into view just as sunset painted the melting snowdrifts in shades of pink and gold. Maria's eyes brightened at the sight of home, and even Jed felt something ease in his chest as they approached. His wolf dog bounded down to meet them, tail wagging furiously. Maria laughed as the animal nearly knocked her over in its excitement, and Jed couldn't help but smile. The dog had grown as fond of her as he had of her cooking. "Welcome home, Mrs. Turlow," Jed said quietly as he helped her down from the cart. The words still felt strange on his tongue, but not unpleasant. Maria touched his arm gently. "Thank you, husband." They worked together to unload the cart and settle the mule in its shelter. The cabin had grown cold in their absence, but soon Maria had a fire crackling in the hearth, while Jed brought in fresh water from the spring. The next morning dawned clear and mild. Maria rose early, wrapping herself in a shawl against the mountain chill. After breakfast, she gathered the herb seedlings they'd bought in town and began preparing a small plot near the cabin's south wall. "My mother taught me which plants bring healing," she explained as she worked the soil, "and the sisters at the mission showed me how to tend a proper kitchen, garden." Her hands moved surely, settling each tiny plant with care. Jed watched her for a moment before turning to his own tasks. The winter had been hard on the fencing, and several sections needed mending before any cattle could be let out to graze. He spent the morning splitting rails and driving new posts into the softening ground. By midday, the sun had grown warm enough that he stripped down to his shirt sleeves. From his position along the fence line, he could see Maria still at work in her garden, her dark hair gleaming as she bent over the newly turned earth. The sight stirred something peaceful in him, like a psalm made visible. A week passed in comfortable routine. The mountain air grew milder with each passing day, though nights remained crisp. Rivers ran high with melting snow, their rushing voices a constant background to their daily tasks. Then came the mail carrier, trudging up their trail on snowshoes despite the declining drifts. "Better safe than sorry on these spring paths," he explained, handing over their bundle of letters. Among the usual correspondence was a telegram from Durango, its yellow paper stark against the other envelopes. Jed's hands tightened as he read the brief message. "Rail agent contests deed stop claim invalid under blood law. Stop appeal pending stop." The paper crumpled in his fist. Without a word, he stormed into the cabin and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Inside, he paced like a caged bear, rage building with each step. 20 years of honest work on this land, and now some railroad desk man thought he could steal it with a scratch of his pen? He was still fuming when Maria entered quietly a few minutes later. She stood in the doorway, watching him with calm eyes. "I reckon you saw the telegram," he growled. "Yes." She moved to the fireplace and began preparing coffee, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "But slamming doors will not change what is written on paper." Jed's anger deflated slightly at her steady tone. He slumped into his chair by the hearth. "I'm sorry about the door," he muttered. "It's just these railroad men thinking they can take whatever they want because—" He trailed off, not wanting to speak the ugly truth of their prejudice. Maria poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. "Because I am Mexican and Apache?" She settled into her own chair. "Yes, I know. But their hatred is their burden to carry, not ours. What burden we carry is losing this land if they win their appeal," Jed said bitterly. "Then we must fight with weapons they do not expect." Maria reached for the worn family Bible on the mantel. "Not with anger, but with prayer and patience." She opened the book to the Psalms, pages soft with use. "Will you read with me?" Jed wanted to resist, to hold on to his righteous anger. But something in her quiet strength called to him. He set down his coffee cup and moved his chair closer to hers. "Which psalm?" he asked gruffly. "The 27th. She found the page and held the Bible where they both could see. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Together they read the ancient words of comfort and courage. Jed's voice grew steadier as they continued, matching Maria's gentle cadence. When they finished, the cabin felt somehow larger, as if the walls had expanded to hold something more than just their worry. Maria closed the Bible carefully. "We will ride down again when the roads are firmer," she said. "And we will face whatever comes with faith that God's justice is greater than man's greed." Jed looked at her, this woman who had arrived like a storm-blown bird at his door and now anchored him with her quiet strength. "You truly believe that?" "I believe in the God who led me here," she said simply, "and I believe he did not bring us together only to see us broken." Outside, the spring wind rustled through awakening pines. The sound of the swollen river carried up from the valley, speaking of change and renewal. Jed reached across and took Maria's hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Then we'll wait until the road's dry," he said, "and face whatever comes together." Maria squeezed his hand in response, and they sat in companionable silence as evening settled over their mountain home. The telegram lay forgotten on the table, its threats diminished by the stronger power of shared faith and purpose. Later, as Maria prepared their supper, Jed stepped outside to check on the animals one last time. The sunset painted the melting snowdrifts in shades of rose and gold, and new grass was beginning to show in sheltered hollows. Looking at the land he'd worked for so many years, he felt his earlier rage transform into something more like resolve. Let the railroad men come with their papers and their prejudices. He and Maria would meet them with the strength of their joint claim, their shared prayers, and the justice of their cause. The mountain spring had taught him patience. Some battles were won not by force, but by standing firm and letting God's time unfold. Spring sunshine warmed the streets of Durango as Jed and Maria made their way to the land office. The morning air held the fresh scent of new leaves and warming earth, but Jed's jaw remained tight with tension. 3 weeks had passed since the telegram arrived, and now they faced another confrontation with the railroad's representative. Inside the office, Mr. Thomas Cargill sat behind his polished desk, not bothering to rise when they entered. His expensive suit and carefully trimmed mustache marked him as a man who valued appearance above substance. He barely glanced at Maria before addressing Jed with a practiced smile. "Mr. Turlow, I trust you've reconsidered our previous discussion?" Cargill's voice dripped with false courtesy. "The railroad's offer for water rights remains generous, considering the circumstances." Jed placed the deed papers on the desk. "The circumstances being that my wife and I own this land legal and proper, with Judge Wilkes himself witnessing our claim." Cargill's smile thinned. He picked up the papers with 2 fingers, as if they might soil his hands. "Ah yes, your unusual arrangement. Tell me, how much did this bit of charity cost you? Taking in a half-breed mission girl to secure your water rights?" The room went deadly quiet. Maria touched Jed's arm, but he had already stepped forward, his face darkening like a thundercloud. "You watch your mouth when speaking of my wife." "Wife?" Cargill laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Come now, Turlo. We both know what this is. Some confused Mexican Indian girl raised on mission handouts, claiming rights to valuable American property. The courts will never—" Jed's fist connected with Cargill's jaw before he could finish the sentence. The crack of bone was audible in the small office. The land agent toppled backward, chair and all, crashing to the floor with a startled cry of pain. "Jed, no!" Maria's voice cut through his rage, but it was too late. Heavy boots pounded on the wooden sidewalk outside. The office door burst open as Deputy Marshal Fletcher charged in, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene. Cargill sprawled on the floor, clutching his face, Jed standing over him with clenched fists, Maria pressed against the wall with wide eyes. "What in blazes is going on here?" the deputy demanded. Cargill struggled to speak through his rapidly swelling jaw. "Assault! He attacked me! Arrest him!" The deputy moved quickly, pulling iron handcuffs from his belt. "Jed Turlo, you're under arrest for assault and battery." He grabbed Jed's wrists, clicking the cuffs into place. Maria stepped forward. "Please, Deputy Marshal, Mr. Cargill provoked him with terrible insults. He—" "Sorry, ma'am," Fletcher interrupted, not unkindly. "But words ain't excuse for breaking a man's jaw. The law's clear on that." He turned to Jed. "Come along now. Doctor can look at him while you cool your heels in jail." Jed allowed himself to be led out, his anger already cooling into shame as he caught Maria's distressed expression. The short walk to the jailhouse seemed to take forever, with townspeople stopping to stare at the spectacle. Inside the jail, Fletcher removed the handcuffs and locked Jed in a cell. "Judge Wilkes is riding circuit," he explained. "Won't be back for 3 days at least. You'll have to wait for him to sort this out." Maria appeared at the jailhouse door, composed despite her obvious worry. "May I speak with my husband?" The deputy nodded. "Keep it brief for now. You can visit during regular hours starting tomorrow." When they were alone, Maria approached the cell. Jed couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "Lost my temper. Shouldn't have done it." "No, you shouldn't have," she agreed softly. "Violence solves nothing. But what's done is done." She reached through the bars to touch his hand. "I will find a room at Mrs. Callahan's boarding house and wait for the judge's return." "You should go back to the cabin," Jed protested. "Not safe for you alone in town." Maria's chin lifted slightly. "I will not abandon you here. We face this together, remember?" Before Jed could argue further, Deputy Fletcher returned. "Time's up for today, ma'am. You can come back tomorrow at visiting hours." Maria squeezed Jed's hand once more before leaving. Through the small window, he watched her walk away, her straight-backed dignity a reproach to his loss of control. The next day, she returned carrying fresh bread and his Bible from their saddlebags. They sat on either side of the bars while she read psalms aloud, her gentle voice soothing his restless spirit. Each day's visit found him calmer, more ashamed of his violent outburst. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told her on the second day. "About fighting with weapons they don't expect. Should have listened better." Maria smiled. There is still time to choose a different path. That evening, she returned to Mrs. Callahan's boarding house, where the widow had given her a spare room overlooking the street. After supper, Mrs. Callahan poured them both cups of tea and settled into her favorite chair. "You know," the older woman said thoughtfully, The railroad men like to pretend that education and breeding belong only to their kind. But I've taught school here 20 years, and I've seen plenty of so-called gentlemen who couldn't match the learning of mission-raised students. Maria looked up from her tea. What do you mean? I mean that Mr. Cargill insulted not just your heritage, but your upbringing. The missions keep careful records of their students' achievements. If you could gather testimony about your education, your character. Mrs. Callahan paused significantly. Well, it might help Judge Wilkes see the truth of things. Maria set down her cup, eyes brightening. The sisters at Santa Fe kept all our examination papers, and Father Ramon's successor, Father Diego, he knows my whole history. Then I suggest you start writing letters tonight, Mrs. Callahan said, rising to fetch paper and ink from her desk. I'll add my own testimony as a qualified teacher, speaking to your evident education and refinement. Maria worked late into the night, composing careful letters by lamplight. To the mission sisters, she wrote of her years of study, requesting copies of her academic records. To Father Diego, she explained the situation and asked him to verify her character and the circumstances of Father Ramon's trust. When she finally went to bed, the moon was high over Durango's quiet streets. In his cell, Jed too lay awake, thinking of how his fist had betrayed everything Maria's gentle faith had been teaching him. Tomorrow she would visit again, bringing more than just bread and scripture. She would bring the promise of redemption through patience and truth rather than violence. The moonlight traced silver bars across his cell floor, but they no longer felt like barriers. Instead, they reminded him of the way Maria's faith drew lines of light through his darkness, showing him a better path forward. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since his arrest, he slept peacefully. In her room at Mrs. Callahan's, Maria sealed the last letter with a prayer. Tomorrow she would post them and continue her patient vigil, trusting that justice guided by mercy would prevail. Outside her window, the same moon that watched over Jed's cell blessed the sleeping town, its light falling equally on all who dwelt below, making no distinction between races or stations in life. The Durango courthouse buzzed with whispers as townsfolk filed in that Wednesday morning. Spring sunshine streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of curiosity seekers and local merchants, all eager to witness the unusual proceedings. Maria Esperanza entered quietly, her simple gray dress and dark shawl a stark contrast to the elaborate bustles and bonnets of the town ladies. Mrs. Callahan walked beside her, head held high, silently daring anyone to whisper an unkind word. They took their seats in the front row, where Maria folded her hands in her lap and fixed her eyes on the judge's empty bench. Thomas Cargill sat at the plaintiff's table, his jaw still visibly swollen and discolored. Next to him, a sharp-featured lawyer in an expensive Eastern suit shuffled papers importantly. The man kept shooting superior glances toward Maria, his lip curling slightly each time. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise! The Territorial Court of Colorado is now in session, the Honorable Judge Amos Wilkes presiding." Judge Wilkes entered, his black robes swishing as he took his seat. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and his weathered face was grave as he surveyed the packed courtroom. "Be seated," he commanded. "We're here to address two matters, the assault charge against Jedediah Turlow and the contested land deed of the Turlow Homestead Spring. Let's proceed." Cargill's lawyer rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the railroad's position is clear. This supposed deed is invalid on its face. The named party," he gestured dismissively toward Maria, "is clearly unfit to own white man's land. She's a woman of mixed blood, raised on mission charity. The very idea that she could hold legitimate title to valuable water rights is absurd." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maria's back stiffened, but she kept her eyes forward, dignity intact. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, her supposed marriage to Turlo is nothing but a transparent attempt to circumvent property laws. We ask the court to void this fraudulent arrangement and clear the way for proper development of these resources. Judge Wilkes's bushy eyebrows drew together. I'll hear from Mrs. Callahan first, he said, consulting a paper. You've asked to testify regarding Miss Esperanza's character? Mrs. Callahan rose, straightening her black widow's dress. I have, Your Honor. As a certified teacher with 20 years' experience in this territory, I can speak to Maria's education and character. Proceed. I've examined Maria's academic records from the Santa Fe Mission School. Her command of English, Spanish, and Latin exceeds many college-educated men. She reads scripture daily, keeps perfect accounts, and conducts herself with unfailing honesty and grace. Mrs. Callahan's voice grew stronger. In my professional opinion, she is more qualified to manage property than half the speculators who've passed through this town. The lawyer jumped up. Objection. The witness's personal opinions are irrelevant to the legal question of property rights. Overruled, Judge Wilkes said firmly. This court will hear all pertinent testimony about the parties involved. He turned to Maria. Mrs. Turlo, would you like to speak? Maria rose slowly, her voice clear and steady in the hushed courtroom. Yes, Your Honor. I wish to tell the truth of how this deed came to be. All eyes fixed on her as she began her story. 20 years ago, raiders attacked the mission where I lived as an orphan. Fire was everywhere. I was only a small child, choking on smoke, when Jed Turlo found me. He carried me through the flames and rode 2 days to bring me to safety at Santa Fe. She drew a deep breath. Father Ramon raised me there, teaching me both God's love and earthly knowledge. Before he died, he wrote this deed and his final letter. Not to deny anyone's rights, but to protect a life he valued. He knew that without legal claim to home and water, I would be at the mercy of those who see only my race, not my soul. The courtroom was utterly silent now. Even the lawyer had stopped fidgeting with his papers. I came to Jed Turlo's door because Father Ramon's last wish joined my name to his land. I stayed because I found a good man there, one who has learned to see past the anger that once ruled him. We were married before God and the law, not for property, but because grace led us to that choice. Judge Wilkes studied her thoughtfully. Bailiff, he said at last, bring in the prisoner. Jed shuffled in, hands and feet shackled. 3 days in jail had left his face unshaven, but his eyes were clear as he faced the judge. Mr. Turlo, Wilkes said, before I rule on these matters, I'd like to hear your statement. Jed's voice was rough but steady. Your Honor, I've done much wrong in my life. Fought Indians in my younger days, killed men in anger, lived wild and godless. But the Lord gave me a second chance through her. He looked at Maria. She brought faith and mercy back to my house. When that railroad man insulted her, I fell back into rage. That was wrong, but I'll stand by her rights to that land until my dying day. The judge nodded slowly. Mr. Cargill, do you wish to speak? Cargill tried to talk through his wired jaw, but his lawyer waved him, silent. Your Honor, these emotional appeals don't change the legal facts. The railroad's claim is denied. Judge Wilkes's voice cut through the lawyer's protest like a knife. I find the deed valid and the marriage legitimate. As for the assault charge, he fixed Jed with a stern look. You'll pay a fine of $50 and make restitution for Mr. Cargill's medical bills. Violence has no place in my courtroom, no matter the provocation. He stood, commanding attention. Let me be clear. This territory's future depends on justice applied equally to all its people. When we deny property rights based on race or station, we mock the very law we claim to uphold. This case is closed." The gavel cracked down with finality. As the bailiff moved to unshackle Jed, Maria stepped forward to meet him. Their eyes met in silent understanding, a moment of triumph tempered by humility, of justice strengthened by mercy. Mrs. Callahan touched Maria's shoulder. "Come along, dear. Let's get your husband cleaned up and fed before you head home." The townsfolk filed out, their whispered discussions already turning this morning's drama into tomorrow's legend. Through the courthouse windows, spring sunshine continued to pour down, warming the earth without asking about the color of those who walked beneath it. The sharp crack of Judge Wilkes's gavel echoed through the packed courtroom. His stern voice carried to every corner as he delivered his final ruling. This court finds the trust established by Father Ramon to be valid and binding. Mrs. Maria Turlow's ownership of the spring and surrounding lands is hereby fully recognized under territorial law. He paused, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Furthermore, Mr. Thomas Cargill is found guilty of attempting to defraud this court through false claims and racial prejudice. He is hereby fined $500. The judge's weathered hands shuffled through his papers before continuing. As for the spring itself, given its historical significance and the testimony we've heard, I am ordering it to be designated as public water access under Mrs. Turlow's stewardship. This arrangement honors both the land's sacred history and the community's needs. A moment of stunned silence filled the courtroom. Then Mrs. Callahan started clapping, her proud smile directed at Maria. Others joined in, ranchers, shopkeepers, and townsfolk who had been moved by the morning's testimony. The applause grew until it filled the high-ceilinged room with a thunder of approval. Maria sat very still, tears sliding down her cheeks. Beside her, Mrs. Callahan squeezed her hand. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, dear," she whispered. Cargill and his lawyer gathered their papers and stormed out, but few noticed their departure. The bailiff was already removing Jed's shackles. He rubbed his wrists, looking dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Judge Wilkes stood, gathering his robes. "This court is adjourned." The gavel struck one final time. People began filing out into the bright spring morning. Maria made her way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and quiet congratulations. When she stepped outside, she found Jed kneeling in the dusty street, his gray head bowed. "Thank you, Lord," he prayed hoarsely. "Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for sending her to teach this old sinner about faith." Maria touched his shoulder gently. "Come, husband, stand up now." He took her offered hand, rising slowly. His eyes were wet as he looked at her. "The Father kept his promise," she said softly in Spanish, then repeated it in English. "Through all these years, through all our doubts, he kept his promise." Mrs. Callahan approached, her black dress swishing. "You'll stay with me tonight, both of you. No sense starting the journey home this late in the day. I've got fresh bread baking and a pot of stew on the stove." They followed her to the boarding house, where the afternoon passed in quiet celebration. Other lodgers stopped by to shake Jed's hand or pat Maria's shoulder. The widow served them generous bowls of rich beef stew with dumplings, and they sat around her kitchen table long into the evening, talking softly about God's mysterious ways. When the first light of dawn began painting the eastern sky, Maria and Jed were already up and loading their wagon. Mrs. Callahan wrapped fresh bread and cheese in a cloth for their journey. "You'll come visit soon?" she asked, embracing Maria. "I want to see what you've done with those flower seeds I gave you." "As soon as the spring planting is finished," Maria promised. "And you must come up to the cabin when the weather's fair. Jed helped Maria onto the wagon bench, then climbed up beside her. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. Their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. She nodded, squeezing his hand. The wagon creaked as they started moving, their mules' hooves clicking steadily on the packed dirt of Durango's main street. Behind them, Mrs. Callahan waved from her porch until they turned the bend toward the mountain trail. The sun rose higher as they drove, warming the spring morning. Maria began humming one of her Spanish hymns, her voice carrying sweet and clear on the mountain air. Jed listened, feeling a peace he had never known in all his years of solitude. They were more than halfway home when he finally spoke again. "I reckon the father knew what he was doing all along." "Yes," Maria said simply. "He did." The wagon rolled on toward the mountains, carrying them home together, the old trapper and his young wife, bound now by more than just a deed and a promise. Behind them, Durango grew smaller in the distance, while ahead, the San Juan peaks rose bright and clean against the morning sky. The mountain meadows blazed with springtime glory. Wild iris dotted the almish grass like purple stars, while fresh aspen leaves shimmered silver green in the breeze. Near the cabin, beneath a natural cathedral of tall aspens, neighbors gathered for the ceremony that would seal what God and circumstance had already joined. Maria stood before a weathered wooden cross, her mission shawl gleaming pure white in the May sunlight. She had washed it special for this day, along with the simple cream dress beneath. Her dark eyes shone with quiet joy as she watched Jed approach in his freshly cleaned coat, his gray hair neatly combed. The traveling preacher, Reverend Harrison, had arrived 3 days earlier on his circuit through the mountain settlements. He stood now with his worn Bible, looking out over the small assembly. Homesteaders from neighboring valleys, Mrs. Callahan, who had made the journey up from Durango, and 3 Apache families Maria had known through her mother. They sat together peacefully, united in witness to this blessed union. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying clear in the mountain air, "we are gathered here today." As he spoke the ancient words, a pair of eagles circled overhead, their wings catching the sunlight. Maria saw them and smiled, remembering her mother's teachings about such signs. Jed noticed, too, his weathered face softening as he took Mariah's small hand in his. They spoke their vows beneath the whispering aspens. Jed's voice was rough with emotion as he pledged his life and love to the woman who had arrived on his doorstep that snowy evening. Maria's words came clear and sweet, first in English, then in Apache, honoring both the worlds that had shaped her path to this moment. After the final prayer, Maria retrieved a small silver cross from her pocket, the one Father Ramon had carried on his rosary for so many years. Together, she and Jed mounted it carefully above their cabin door, marking their home as a place of faith and sanctuary. The celebration lasted through the afternoon, with plenty of venison stew and Mrs. Callahan's fresh-baked bread. The Apache families shared traditional songs, their voices rising pure and strong into the evening air. As the sun began to set, guests departed with warm embraces and prayers of blessing. Later, in the quiet of their cabin, Maria and Jed sat together at their table. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over their faces as they shared a simple supper. Through the open window came the sound of the creek, swollen with spring melt, rushing down from the high country that was now truly their home. Near the hearth stood the cradle Jed had crafted over the winter months, empty now, but filled with the promise of future joy. Its smooth pine wood gleamed in the firelight, waiting. Jed reached across the table and took Maria's hand. "You came to be my wife," he said softly, his voice thick with gratitude, "and saved me twice over, once from death and once from myself." She squeezed his fingers gently, her wedding ring catching the lamplight. Outside their window, the first stars were appearing over the valley, the same stars that had guided her here through the winter storm. But now they shone down on a home transformed by love, faith, and the mysterious workings of God's own time. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.